Silas Thorne was a mountain man, but his heart had grown as weary as the old leather on his boots. For 20 years he had lived off the land, finding solace in the silence of the high peaks and the stark beauty of the untamed wilderness. But the silence had begun to echo with the ghosts of his past. The memory of his wife, a cholera victim who had left him alone on a Colorado homestead a decade ago. He was a mountain of a man, with a beard that tangled like a thicket and eyes that held the hard-earned wisdom of solitude, yet he yearned for a different kind of peace. He had heard whispers of a forgotten town called Redemption Creek, a ghost of a settlement that had barely survived a failed gold rush. What drew him there was a single, improbable detail: an abandoned stone church. The idea of trading the raw, unpredictable wild for a quiet, solid foundation had taken root in his mind. He sold his traps and furs, packed his meager belongings, and rode down from the high country. The town was little more than a dusty collection of shacks and a dry goods store run by an old woman named Martha, who smelled of peppermint and regret. When Silas asked about the church, her eyes narrowed. "That place is cursed, mister. Been empty for a decade. Folks say it's where sins come to rot." Silas didn't believe in curses. He believed in stone and mortar, in the quiet permanence of things built to last. He found the church on the outskirts of town, a hulking skeleton of grey stone against the vast empty sky. A few windows were boarded up, and a large crack ran down the front wall, but it was solid. He met with the town's land registrar, a hunched man who seemed more surprised than happy to make the sale. For a small sum and a handshake, the church became his. Silas felt a strange sense of purpose. He wasn't building a home, he was building a haven, a place to finally lay his ghosts to rest. He didn't know he was about to trade one kind of wilderness for another, one far more dangerous and human. The day after the purchase, a chill wind swept across the plains, bringing with it a dusting of red dust that clung to everything. Silas arrived at the church with a bag of tools and a lantern. The large wooden doors were swollen shut, but he forced them open with a grunt, revealing an interior swallowed by shadows and dust. The air was thick with the scent of decay and old wood. Beams of light sliced through the gaps in the roof, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the stillness. Pews lay toppled, and a thick layer of grime coated the stained glass windows, obscuring the faded saints. He moved slowly, his heavy boots echoing through the hollow space. He ran his hand over a splintered pew, feeling the history of a place long abandoned. He was admiring the sturdy construction of the altar when he heard a faint sound, a choked sob, barely audible over the howl of the wind. Silas froze. His hand went to the pistol on his hip, a reflex honed by years in the mountains. He listened, his breath held. The sound came again, a desperate, muffled gasp. It wasn't a ghost. It was real. His heart began to pound with a different kind of rhythm, not of fear but of an old forgotten instinct. He followed the sound to the front of the church, to the very altar itself. He held his lantern high, and the weak light cut through the gloom. There, bound and gagged, stood a young woman, her wrists tied tightly with thick rope, the end of which was secured to a rafter above. A noose of rough twine was already around her neck. Her eyes, wide with terror and shadowed with bruises, were locked on the two men who stood before her. One was a hulking brute with a dirt-caked face and a cruel smile. The other was smaller, but his face held a cold malevolence that was far more disturbing. The smaller man was cinching the rope, preparing to kick the stool out from under her feet. She was wearing a simple white wedding dress, now torn and stained with dirt. The title was a lie, a terrible promise about to be kept. She hadn't been hanged yet. She was a bride, but she was about to become a corpse. Silas didn't hesitate. The years in the mountains had taught him to react instantly to danger. With a roar that seemed to shake the old church's foundations, he charged. The two men, startled, fumbled for their weapons. The larger man drew a bowie knife, while the smaller one went for a pistol. Silas, a force of nature, was upon them before they could aim. He sidestepped the larger man's clumsy lunge and delivered a powerful blow to his jaw. The man crumpled, dropping his knife with a clatter. The smaller man, his hand still on his pistol, was more cunning. He aimed the weapon, but Silas was quicker. He seized the man's wrist, twisting it with a painful snap that made the man cry out and drop the pistol. Silas followed through with a right hook that sent him sprawling. Silas wasn't there to kill. He was there to stop this horror. "Get out," he growled, his voice a low thunder. "Get out and don't come back." The two men, a dazed heap on the floor, looked up at the towering figure who had appeared from the shadows. The larger man, a trail of blood seeping from his nose, scrambled to his feet. "You'll regret this, old man," he spat. "That's our woman. She's promised to my brother, and she broke her vow." "She belongs to no man," Silas said, stepping forward. He picked up the discarded bowie knife, its blade glinting in the faint light. He did not threaten them with it, but the simple act of holding the weapon conveyed his lethal intent. The two men cowed, backed away, their bravado gone. They stumbled out the broken doors, leaving behind the dust and the silence. Silas turned his attention back to the woman. Her body was trembling, her eyes still wide with shock. He climbed onto the altar, his heavy boots making a soft thud on the wood. He used his knife to slice through the thick rope that bound her hands. The rope fell, and she collapsed, half falling into his arms. He carefully held her, a strange, powerful sensation of a living, breathing person in his embrace. He gently removed the gag and the noose, which had left a red, raw mark on her throat. She coughed and took in a few ragged breaths, tears streaming down her bruised face. "It's over now," he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. "You're safe." Silas led her to a patch of ground that was relatively free of debris and sat her down gently. She was a frail thing, her wedding dress in tatters, her face pale beneath the dirt. Her eyes, however, held a spark of fire, a desperate resilience that had not yet been extinguished. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She hesitated, her gaze flickering from him to the church, as if she were still processing what had just happened. "Ilara," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Ilara Thorne." Silas froze. The coincidence was too jarring to ignore. "I'm Silas Thorne," he said, and a flicker of something passed through her eyes. She began to speak, her story spilling out in a rush of frightened words. She was from a small, isolated settlement a day's ride away. Her father, a man burdened by debt and a drinking problem, had promised her hand in marriage to one of the men who had just tried to hang her, the younger, colder one. His name was Jedediah, and his brother was Amos. The family was a known menace in their community, and Jedediah was a man of particular cruelty. "He saw me as a possession," she said, her voice shaking. "I was to be his wife, his property. I couldn't bear it." On her wedding day, she had planned to escape. She had a friend who was supposed to help her. They were to meet at a pre-arranged rendezvous point, a landmark she knew of from tales passed down by travelers. The old stone church in Redemption Creek. "It was our only hope," she said, her shoulders slumping. "But I was found out. Jedediah and Amos, they caught me before I could make it." They had planned to make a gruesome public example of her. She was a runaway bride, a public embarrassment, and their fury demanded a brutal public response. The altar of the church was to be her gallows, a symbol of her supposed treachery. Silas listened, his expression a stone mask. Her story was not one of fantasy or superstition, but of brutal human cruelty, of a woman caught in a trap with no easy way out. He had saved her from one kind of wilderness, a physical human one. Now he was faced with another, the emotional and social wasteland of her life, and he was the only thing standing between her and the men who still sought to claim her. The silence that fell after Ilara's story was thick with unspoken questions. Ilara, despite her exhaustion, watched Silas with a mixture of suspicion and gratitude. He was a giant of a man, his face weathered and stern. She had no reason to trust him, other than the fact that he had saved her from a fate far worse than death. "Where will you go now?" Silas asked, his voice low. "I don't know," she admitted, her shoulders slumping. "I have no one. My father, he would have let them have me. My friend, he would be in danger now too. They won't stop looking for me." Silas sighed, a sound that seemed to rumble from his chest. He was a man who prized his solitude. The last thing he had wanted was to be saddled with a frightened young woman, but he couldn't leave her. The law in these parts was distant and slow, and the men who had tried to hang her were likely to return. He looked at the cracked walls of the church, the broken pews, the dirt and decay, and saw the ruins of something. Then he looked at Ilara and saw another kind of ruin, a human one. "You can stay here," he said gruffly. "For now. They won't think to look for you in the very place they left you." Ilara's eyes widened. "But you just bought this place." "I did," he replied, his tone final, "and I'm going to fix it. You can stay and help. I have some food, a little water. We'll make do." It was a reluctant offer, a fragile truce born of necessity. Ilara, with no other options, nodded. The first few days were a tense dance around each other. Silas worked on the church, mending the roof and securing the windows, his movements precise and strong. Ilara swept and organized, clearing away decades of filth, her small hands surprisingly capable. They communicated in clipped, short sentences, their pasts a chasm between them, the mountain man and the runaway bride, both trying to rebuild their lives in a forgotten place. As the days turned into a week, the silence between Silas and Ilara began to soften. The constant work was a bridge between them. He would hand her a hammer, and she would take it without a word, a silent acknowledgement of their partnership. The church slowly began to shed its decrepit state. The light streamed in through mended windows, and the pews were upright again, lined in neat rows. One evening, as a cold rain began to fall, they sat by a small fire Silas had built in the center of the church, the smoke rising through a hole he'd cut in the roof. The rhythmic patter of the rain on the stone was the only sound. "You're good with your hands," Ilara said, her voice quiet. Silas grunted in agreement. "Learned it from my father. He was a carpenter. My wife, she loved a good, strong home." Ilara's eyes softened. "You were married?" Silas nodded, his gaze distant. "Her name was Sarah. She loved this kind of land, the open sky. We had a good life, for a time." He spoke of her with a gentle ache in his voice, a grief that had not diminished with time. Ilara then spoke of her own life, not just the recent terror. She spoke of her mother, a kind woman who had taught her to sew and to read, of a childhood that had not been entirely without joy. She spoke of the gradual decline of her family's fortunes, the slow suffocation of debt, and the terrible finality of her father's choice. They were two souls, bruised by life, finding a strange comfort in their shared vulnerability. The mountain man was not the brute she had first perceived, but a man of deep sorrow and quiet strength. The runaway bride was not a helpless victim, but a woman of steel, a survivor who had fought for her own life. The church was no longer a tomb of sins, but a sanctuary of two wounded hearts, learning to heal together. The foundation of the building was being repaired, but so was the foundation of their trust. The fragile peace was shattered on a cold, blustery morning. The dust storm that had swept in a week earlier had subsided, replaced by a harsh, clear sunlight. As Silas was hauling a large beam into the church, he heard the sound of approaching horses. It was a sound he knew instinctively was trouble. Jedediah and Amos rode up to the church, their faces grim and determined. This time they were not laughing. Their eyes scanned the restored windows and the mended doors with a mixture of confusion and fury. Silas, his axe in his hand, stood in the doorway, a human wall. "Where is she?" Jedediah snarled, his gaze hard. "We know she's in there." "She's not here," Silas said, his voice as flat and unmoving as a stone. "Liar!" Amos sneered, dismounting. We saw you take her. We want her back. She is our property." Silas's grip tightened on the axe handle. "The way I see it, she was never your property to begin with, and she won't be now." Jedediah reached for the pistol in his belt. Silas's movement was a blur of practiced speed. He raised the axe, not to strike, but to stand as a symbol of his resolve. "You touch that gun, and you'll be the second man I've buried in this town," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The brothers hesitated. They had underestimated Silas. They had expected a simple, cowardly man. They had found a mountain man who had seen death up close and no longer feared it. Jedediah, with a glint of cunning in his eyes, lowered his hand. "This isn't over, old man," he spat. "You can't hide her forever. We'll be back, and when we do, we won't be alone." They turned their horses and rode off, leaving the taste of their threat hanging in the air. Inside the church, Ilara had been listening, her face pale. She came out now, her hands trembling. "They won't stop," she whispered. "I'm a danger to you, Silas. I should go." "No," he said, his gaze firm. "You're no danger. They are. And I'm not going to let them have you." He put a calloused hand on her shoulder. The touch was firm, not romantic, but a promise. The mountain man, who had lived for years in solitude, had just declared his purpose, to protect. And for the first time since she had fled her wedding, Ilara felt truly, completely safe. The threat of Jedediah and Amos hung in the air like a storm on the horizon. But rather than paralyze them with fear, it galvanized Silas and Ilara. They worked with a new sense of urgency, no longer just repairing the church, but fortifying it. Silas taught Ilara how to load and clean his rifle, and she learned to watch the horizon for any approaching riders. In the midst of this shared struggle, a deeper bond began to form. They talked more freely, sharing their dreams for the future. Silas spoke of how he had always wanted to build a real community, a place where people could find a true home. Ilara spoke of a simple life, free from fear, where she could read and work with her hands. Their shared purpose created a powerful current that flowed between them. One evening, as a sliver of moon hung in the dark sky, Ilara looked at Silas as he stared out the window, his large frame silhouetted against the night. "Why did you save me?" she asked, her voice soft. He turned, his eyes holding a depth she hadn't seen before. "I lost everything once," he said, his voice a low rasp. "My wife, my hope. I thought I'd find peace out here in this solitude. But all I found was a hollow space. When I saw you about to lose your life to men who saw you as nothing, something inside me changed. I realized that a life without connection, without purpose, isn't a life at all." He took a step closer to her, and the distance between them, once a chasm, now felt small. "You're a testament to something good in the world, Ilara," he said, his voice tinged with a raw emotion, and I realized I couldn't bear to let that be snuffed out. His hand came up, and with a surprising gentleness, he touched the red mark on her throat, a scar from the rope. He was not just a rescuer, he was a man who saw her, truly saw her, for who she was, a survivor with a fierce spirit. The romance was not a sudden burst of passion, but a slow, quiet flame that had been lit by shared trauma and mutual respect. In that moment, surrounded by the stones of the old church, they both realized they were no longer two separate people, but two halves of a new whole. The brothers returned a few days later, just as promised, but this time they were not alone. Jedediah and Amos were accompanied by 3 other men, all of them hard-faced and armed. They were prepared for a fight. "We told you we'd be back," Jedediah said, his voice thick with triumph. "Give us the woman. We don't want to hurt you." Silas stood in the doorway, his rifle in his hand. Ilara was inside, her own small pistol clutched in her hand. "The offer stands. She's not going anywhere with you." The leader of the new men, a grizzled man with a missing finger, stepped forward. "You're a fool, stranger. You can't fight all of us." Silas didn't answer. He simply raised his rifle and fired a shot that whizzed past the leader's ear, a warning shot that echoed through the quiet plains. The men's bravado faltered. They had expected a pushover, not a seasoned marksman. A tense standoff ensued. The men fanned out, surrounding the church, but they were hesitant to rush the fortified stone walls. Ilara, using the training Silas had given her, found a small opening in the wall and used it to light a fire on a small pile of dry brush. The smoke billowed up into the sky. "What's that?" Jedediah yelled, a panicked look in his eyes. "A signal," Silas replied, a grim smile on his face. "This town may be forgotten, but the law isn't. The sheriff in the next county knows where I am. You stay here long enough, and you won't have just me to deal with." It was a bluff, of course. He had no way of knowing if the sheriff would even care. But the lie, combined with the billowing smoke and Silas's unyielding stance, was enough. The men looked at each other, their resolve crumbling. They had not come for a prolonged battle with a stubborn mountain man. They had come to collect a scared woman. The grizzled leader, weighing the risks, spat on the ground. "This ain't worth it, Jedediah. Let's go." Jedediah's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "She's mine." "She was," the leader said, turning his horse. "But you lost her. Time to move on." One by one, the men rode away, leaving Jedediah and Amos alone. They stood there for a long moment, defeated. Silas watched them, his rifle still aimed. Finally, with a cry of frustration, Jedediah and Amos turned their horses and rode off, disappearing into the vast, empty horizon, never to be seen again. The final confrontation left the church in a strange, peaceful silence. Silas lowered his rifle, the weight of the moment settling over him. Ilara came out and looked at the empty horizon, her shoulders finally dropping in a posture of complete release. The fear was gone. The threat was gone. The news of the showdown spread quickly through the small town of Redemption Creek. People, once wary of the old, cursed church, now came to see the man who had bought it and the woman he had saved. They saw not a solitary mountain man, but a man who had chosen to stand for something. They saw not a cursed building, but a symbol of redemption, a place where new beginnings were possible. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Silas and Ilara sat on the steps of the church, their hands clasped between them. The building was no longer a ruin. It was a home. It was a testament to their strength, to their shared journey from solitude and terror to hope and companionship. "I found it," Silas said, his voice soft. "Found what?" Ilara asked. "The peace I was looking for," he said, turning to her. "It wasn't in the mountains, and it wasn't in a quiet place. It was in you. It was in building something that mattered." He looked at the small community that was slowly beginning to stir back to life around them. "And it's in this place, a place for people to come together, to be safe, to find redemption." The title that had promised a tragedy had instead delivered a beginning. The mountain man had bought an old church, but instead of finding a hanged bride, he had found a living, breathing woman. He had found a purpose, and he had found a home. They stood together in the now-repaired church, not as a rescuer and a victim, but as two partners looking out at a world that, for the first time in a long time, felt full of promise. The church had been rebuilt, and so had their lives. They were home.